So I'd like to open by just this sort of big blue bubble of context, right? That's kind of, I feel like where we are as a community is, for the last year or so, some of us who have never really thought about that as a thing are starting to go, oh, that is really relevant. Like what's around our couples and their cycle and their experiences is really relevant. And we have a little metaphor that we wrote it up together for the fall newsletter, actually. And so if you've seen that, you may remember this picture. And this is part of how we were trying to illustrate like how the context can have these subtle effects, and that actually just the fact that people don't notice the context is itself a pretty big injury, or at least a strain much of the time. It's also a source of resilience and skills for those who are seeing it. But so what is pictured here, and Melanie, just jump in if I miss anything, please. What is pictured here is called a cat island. This one is called Aoshima. These are islands in Japan where they long ago imported cats to control the local rodent population. The populations have aged, the islands are mostly elderly, and the cats now outnumber the people 6-1. And so tourists come to the cat islands to like see the cats. And so because so much of whiteness involves the way we've been trained not to notice the system that sometimes benefits us in ways that it doesn't benefit others. And I have to say, in Singapore, there's Chinese privilege because they're 70-80% of the population. It works very similarly. It's about being the majority. It's about being whom the status quo serves best. We're kind of trained not to comment or notice those cats, right? And so for people who are walking off, say you're arriving on a boat on this island and you're walking off the boat and nobody mentions that there's like 400 kitties like strewn across the dock. And then you might start to think, is it me? Are there really cats there? Why is nobody talking about this? And look for signs. Is anybody seeing the cats like scurrying away from our every step? And that's before we get to things like it would be nice if somebody turned and said, hey, aren't you allergic to cats? Are you okay? Do you need a Benadryl? Right? Like there's all sorts of consequences that come from not seeing what essentially is right there in full view that sometimes in the system we've been trained not to see.
And the other thing is, for a person in the marginalized group or historically excluded group, sometimes actually naming the cats, if you don't just get gaslit, which is usually the first step, but if you persist and keep naming the cats, you could either get killed or thrown off the island or have other bad things happen to you, because we have this sort of complicit understanding as a system, as the context is to not mention the cats. If you disrupt that, bad things happen to you when you're in a marginalized group.
Yeah, if I could reach back to the story I told about my husband in 2003, where my view of world, that he had the safety and the privilege I had, and he could do what I could do, and encouraged him to do that, and he got humiliated. Well, that was actually the source of some skill building, because in 2014, something very similar happened, where he again he's a director, and he was directing, and directing sometimes comes up against this stereotype that Asians should be humble and submissive. Well, how are you going to direct people if you're being humble and submissive, right? And so when this happened again in 2014, there were some dicey moments in a similar situation where he ran into that stereotype. Basically, he and a white woman that he was in a conflict with, spoke to each other in exactly the same vernacular, and he got in trouble. And what had happened was she'd been rude to him in an all-hands email, and he was so tired of it at a year and a half into that he overwrote exactly what she wrote and said it back to her, and then he got reprimanded, and she did not. Right? However, this was no longer surprising, and we knew what was happening, and he could see the cats. And so a year later, he ended up with her job. Right? So like resilience had been built through his ability now to name and see and work with the system that doesn't see the cats the way he does. So it was a little bumpy. There were some dicey moments, but he now was able to work with this, and that gave him some real advantages. And so it's not always trauma, right? Like sometimes it's growth. But I have a clip that I hope we're going to have time to play, an audio clip of one of my clients and a couple, where what she's talking about is everybody is, like there's a cat on the dock that she can see very clearly, and then it's like no one else can see it. And she doesn't know what she starts to question, is it me? Is it them? am I doing something wrong? Is there something on my face? Why is everybody looking at me? And of course, the reason they're looking at her is her race was different, right? But instead of knowing for sure that that's what's happening, the fact that this is never mentioned, she's not sure what's happening to her, right? And so that's what I call the cats on the dock. Nobody's naming the obvious.